Hi everyone, thank you for being here, and thank you to Professor Guite for his time. Just a brief introduction. Professor Guite is an English poet, academic, an Anglican priest, and also a fantastic singer. And he is a Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Cambridge and a Master of Arts in English Literature. He obtained his PhD from Durham University, and as you will see, his main area of interest concerns the intersection of religion and the arts in the works of Tolkien and Lewis. Thank you, and please, Guite.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Marco, for that.
May I?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm very impressed when people will come and listen to a lecture in a second language. I don't know how many English undergraduates at Cambridge I would have coming to listen to a lecture in Italian, so already I'm impressed. I also feel at home to be in an old college which is part of an even older university. This makes me feel very much at home because it's very similar in Cambridge, where I was an undergraduate and also where I'm now a life fellow, that the colleges form and then out of them forms the university. And we were saying earlier that there's something about being in an ancient place, there's something about the kind and quality of the building that actually opens out and expands and enhances thought. So I'm very glad to be here. So the title of my lecture to you today is Tolkien, Fantasist or Prophet? When Tolkien and his friends C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams and the philologist Owen Barfield were meeting together and making books together in Oxford in the mid-20th century, really from the 30s through to the 50s. The literary elites, the English establishment, dismissed them as these tweed-clad, beer-drinking neo-medievalists who were looking back on some bygone world. They were seen as a backwater, a side channel. They had missed the mainstream of the development of English literature and thought, or so it was said. So that mainstream poetically was going through Eliot. In terms of novels, it was going through George Orwell. But the presumption was that only those who had encountered and in some sense been changed by what George Steiner called the masters of suspicion, that is to say, Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, the deconstructors, and only these people could be taken seriously. People who still thought of and enjoyed the great formative stories of previous ages were seen somehow as anachronistic, and because anachronistic, irrelevant. However, had those rather snooty critics been right, we would be talking about all the hypermodernists and the postmodernists, and we would not be talking about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. But there they are. And more their work seems to have been far from nostalgic, but actually in an imaginative form to have anticipated many of the problems and issues, not of the 20th, but of the 21st century. So I want to make the case broadly that Tolkien and the other Inklings were forward-thinking rather than backward-thinking. So, to look at the Inklings, as I say, an amazingly productive group of Oxford writers. There were many of them, but the main ones would be regarded as Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Owen Barfield, the philologist, and Charles Williams, the novelist and theologian. So they've been regarded as fantasists, and I want to argue that it was precisely because of their exercise of imagination, their emphasis on imagination as a way of knowing, that has meant they have relevance to us now. Imagination itself is the missing element in the way we have seen the world since the Enlightenment. It's as though we closed one of our eyes and only looked through the eye of an analytical reason, and not the capacity of the imagination, which is to synthesize and to body things forth. So famously, Shakespeare, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, describing the work of the poet, he says, the poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And then he says this, and as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. Because a thing is unknown doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And in a way, the case can be made for the great imaginative writer, especially one like Tolkien, who is working at a deep, almost mythic level, that they body forth, they give shape and form to realities, spiritual realities, psychological realities, political realities, which we would disappear. They're not capable of being expressed in abstract terms. They need to be told in story, and so they can be bodied forth. So it is precisely the emphasis on imagination, which was the reason why they were ignored in their own time, is the very reason why we pay attention to them now. So I think as a group, the Inklings were more coherent, more mutually informing, a mutually supportive group than they're sometimes thought of being. The first book about the Inklings by Humphrey Carpenter suggested the only thing they had in common was being friends of C.S. Lewis. But much more work has been done now in Inkling studies, thorough readings of all their letters between each other and the diary, examination of manuscripts which each of them edited for the other. The book which really sets that out and shows their cohesion is by Diana Glyer. It's called The Company They Keep. So they were more coherent. They share certain ideas which together form not an escape from the past, but actually an engagement with and a critique of modernity. It's also been shown that they were not ignoring the intellectual trends of their day. It's very clear, there's been some really interesting work done on that, for example, C.S. Lewis deeply read Freud. They had all read Nietzsche, they were aware of the teachings of Marx. They were not ignorant of these things. And also, of course, Lewis and Tolkien had been through the paradigmatic, era-defining trauma of the 21st century, which was the First World War. They were both young officers on the Western Front. Lewis was wounded. Both of them came back with trauma to deal with. And some of that trauma is in writing. So literary critics and historians trumpet T.S. Eliot and say the wasteland is the defining post-war thing. Everything is broken to fragments. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. Eliot saw no combat whatsoever, but nevertheless proclaimed the death of narrative and heroism and everything. These men who had been through it had something deeper to say, in my opinion. So they felt that the contemporary, the Inklings, Lewis and Tolkien, were well aware of the reductive materialist analysis of the world, the attempt to account for everything by the kind of action and reaction of particles or the unwinding of enzymes. But they simply thought such an account, while it might be true on one level, was not adequate to the totality of the human experience. And in order to try to restore to us the things that were missing from that reductive account, they turned to myth-making and storytelling. Because in almost every other era, apart from the West in the last 200 years, that was the means whereby you told and preserved and embodied the greatest truths. So I would also like to express the enormous debt that I owe to Tolkien personally, going back to the time when my father read The Hobbit to me as a child and did all the voices. He had a voice for Gandalf and a voice for the trolls, so I loved it. Then I came to love the book, The Lord of the Rings, when I was a teenager, and I have read it many times since. And those books informed my imagination and gave me glimpses of joy. And Tolkien's work provided paradigms for me with which to think, as well as places. You know, there's the kind of tradition in classical literature of the locus aminus, you know, the beautiful place, and Lothlorien and Rivendell. These are places you can inhabit any time you like. You can, as it were, go there and dwell there and draw something from them. So Tolkien also gave me an overarching narrative which was realistic about weakness and evil, about all the dangers of corruption, particularly the corruption of power. An earlier English writer and historian, Lord Acton, famously said, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And of course, this question of power and corruption is right at the heart of the legendarium. So I can't thank God enough for Tolkien. Now, I don't want to rank the Inklings against each other and say quite who was the best and who was the second best. This would be a fruitless thing. However, and I think they work very well mutually, but if we are to think of being gifted as a maker of worlds, as what Tolkien called a sub-creator, and I would simply say a poet, because, of course, the word poet comes from the Greek verb poiein, to make. So if we were to think at the deepest level of being a maker, I think Tolkien is, in fact, the great master of that group. So to be a maker is to have a combination of imagination, inspiration, dedication, craft, internal consistency, and finally a kind of ringing resonance. The chord that is struck in that kind of writing continues to make music inside you long after you have put the book down. So it is resonant. So I would say I think Tolkien is perhaps the most gifted of the Inklings. Lewis has he has an immense reach, but I noticed that there are some people that Tolkien reaches whom C.S. Lewis doesn't reach at all. There's something about Lewis. Maybe he's a bit over-explicit in his allegorizing, or, you know, and people can't quite go there, but Tolkien wins them over completely. So now I want to talk about the way their writing offers us a new way of seeing. And I want to note that there is something which was at the time and continues to be profoundly countercultural and challenging about Tolkien's work. Time and again, he sets up, as it were, a counterpoint to something that's happening in his own society. And just to anticipate a little, right at the core of the whole story of The Lord of the Rings is something extraordinary. Tolkien had access to and familiarity with all the great formative myths and legends of the world, not just Europe and Northern Europe, which he specialized in, but throughout the world. And in almost every story of a quest involving some kind of precious thing or treasure, starting with Jason and the Argonauts, The quest is to acquire something. The hero begins without and goes and finds the thing, which will bring fortune or treasure, or he slays the dragon and gets the gold, or Hercules gets the golden apples of the Hesperides. It is a quest of acquisition. Tolkien, singularly, just at the very cusp of what is to be an age of mass, obsessive, I think, destructive consumerism. We are literally consuming ourselves to death. At the very beginning of that age, instead of writing an epic of acquisition, Tolkien writes an epic of renunciation. The entire thing is about learning to let go. When Gandalf says to Bilbo, stop about the ring, stop possessing it, and it will stop possessing you. He could also be talking to every one of us about our iPhones. Tolkien knows nothing about this, but he puts his finger on something right at the heart of the human psyche and helps us to understand some of our own behaviors. Now, something which he and Lewis and the others had in common, and this brings us into a theological space, is a deep emphasis on the word, on language itself, as something mysterious, something miraculous, something generative, something creative. So the word itself, obviously, is particularly good for a writer to have an emphasis on the word, but to be one of the what the scholars have called the peoples of the book, the three Abrahamic faiths, Christianity and Judaism and Islam, all have this notion not only of the importance of scriptures, the sacral nature of at least some of the written word, and of course our word Bible simply means biblia, it just means book. The Bible is the big book, ta mega ta biblion. So there is already an emphasis on the importance of writing and words. But of course, within the scriptural narrative, in the Christian understanding, there is this extraordinary idea which is at the beginning of John's Gospel. So in the wonderful Greek, en arche, en hologos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. I mean, in the Latin, very beautiful, in principio erat verbum. And of course that in principio, at the beginning of John's Gospel, is a deliberate echo of the in principio creavit, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And in the Genesis narrative, and this is deeply attractive, I think, to all writers and imaginative writers, the world, the cosmos itself, is spoken into being. God utters it. God says, let there be light, fiat lux, and there was light. Now, Tolkien would say, in the case of the deity, his materia, his medium, is reality itself. He is therefore the prime creator. He creates that with which things can be created. He creates ex nihilo. But Tolkien thought that part of the imago Dei in every person is the same power, particularly with language, to create and to summon things. So, although we cannot speak an actual world into being, Tolkien showed us we can come pretty close. We can be what he called sub-creators. We can create what he called a secondary world, which has the inner consistence of reality. And we literally speak it into being. I mentioned Rivendell and Lothlorien, and I was pleased to see some smiles in the room. You have perhaps all been there. And yet, how is it that you have been there? If we were to take the text of the chapter in which the fellowship arrives at Rivendell, or the text of the chapter in which he describes that wonderful moment when they cross the stream into Lothlorien. And Frodo feels that time itself is different, that he's stepped into the elder days, that the rest of the world is flowing on around them, but he's experiencing time itself in a different kind of quality. If we were to take those two great texts and bring them into this room, we would look in vain for the beautiful river. We would look in vain for all we would find is paper and ink. And of course, if we were very scientifically minded and we still had a purely materialist philosophy, we could weigh the books, and we could do a chemical analysis of the paper, and we could do a geometric analysis of the shapes of the letters and a statistical analysis of every. We could work for years and acquire a huge amount of data and never know the true reality of what we were dealing with, because we only looked at its physical substrate. But if somebody walked in while we were analyzing this text physically and opened the book and read it to us, suddenly, oh my goodness, it summons up. But how does that work? How did the rivers and the sound of the falls of the water and the light through the leaves in Lothlorien, how do those things happen? Well, this involves not simply the imagination of Tolkien, but absolutely your imagination. You yourself, if he is a sub-creator, you are a co-creator in his sub-creation. You yourself must find and make the images with the prompt of the words. The words are just the kind of starter kit, and yet they have a magical property. As the words sound in you, so spontaneously the images arise. In that sense, there is a parallel between what Tolkien believed about the first creation, when God speaks and things exist, with this inner creation, when the author speaks, the poet speaks, and between us, a world arises. And in fact, following the poet and philosopher Coleridge, Tolkien believed that even with God's world, which he speaks into being, there is a co-creation going on. That our perception of the world always involves imagination, the synthesizing power of him, as well as, in fact, Coleridge called what he called the primary imagination. I'm quoting Coleridge's Biographia Literaria now. He says, it is the living power and prime agent of all human perception. And then he adds, it is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. So just as Tolkien's subcreation, places like Lothlorien or Rivendell, shimmer into being when his mind meets our mind through the veil of the text, and then the world becomes as we read it. So, Coleridge and others would argue, this world also is a kind of co-creation. So I'll stay with Coleridge for a minute. I should be talking about Tolkien, but I love Coleridge. So Coleridge wrote a very famous poem called Frost at Midnight, in which he was in a little cottage in a very beautiful county in Shire in England, in Somerset. And he was off after the French Revolution. He was a new man. He was helping to look after the child, and he was sitting there with the baby and the diapers and, trying to write poetry while his little baby slept for a bit. And he wrote a poem wondering how his son would grow up and what kind of teacher he would have. And he wanted him not to be shut in a stultifying school, but to learn from nature. So famously, he says, "Thou, my child, shall wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountains which mirror in their bulk both." So he describes the nature. And then he says, "So shalt thou see and hear." But he doesn't say, "So shalt thou see and hear certain meteorological and geological phenomena which you will study later." what he says about seeing this world, he says, so shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God speaks, who doth teach himself in all and all things in himself. Great universal teacher, he shall mold thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. So this is this dynamic. So there is already a role for the human imagination, even in the perception of this world. But Tolkien took this further and thought, we have this privilege as part of the Imago Dei to create secondary worlds. So Tolkien himself remarks on the idea that of utterance, that we utter forth a poem. That the root, the word utter, is cognate with the word outer. So to utter something is to make the inner outer. Indeed, Coleridge said that to make the inner outer and the outer inner, this is the essence of genius in the fine arts. That's Coleridge. So there's something about utterance. Now, Tolkien and also his friend Owen Barfield often remarked on the kind of connection between the different senses of words, allowing us to understand what might have been an earlier unity. So, for example, we still have the word grammar, meaning the syntactical structure and the system and the rules whereby we are able to make sentences. And Marco and I were discussing grammar, we were discussing Chomsky and the idea of generative grammar and a kind of grammar behind all the other grammars. So, but the medieval word for magic, particularly for the magic that comes from incantation, the medieval word is grammary. It has the word grammar in it. And in fact, if you go back far enough to the roots of language, the word glamour, in the sense of the glamour of the magical, is also springing from the same root as grammar. Likewise, the word spell. So when I first as a child encountered the word spell, I was conscious of these two very different meanings. I was slightly dyslexic, and I found spelling very difficult. So spell and to spell was the difficult thing I found hard to do about organizing the letters in the correct order to get the word right. But spell, when my mother told me stories about magicians and magical spells and the spell that was cast, in a story of King Arthur, then I was spellbound. There was another sense of the word spell. And Tolkien and Owen Barfield both agreed that the reason for this is that actually language itself is a kind of magic. It is a kind of creative magic. It has the primal power to summon up and bring before your eyes something which previously didn't exist. Now, they understood it in terms of a sacral theology, but they were not afraid to use the word magic or to use words like fairy to describe this thing. So since I stand before you as much as a poet, as a professore, if you don't mind, I will read you a poem of my own called Spell. And this poem quotes or refers to two great pieces of writing by Tolkien about this extraordinary magic. One is the poem Mythopoeia, and the other is the famous essay on fairy stories. But so I wrote this poem marveling at the 26 letters of the alphabet. Just the fact that we could recombine these letters and make everything. When I was teaching writing in school, and my students were saying, "Oh, this is so difficult, I can't do it." I would say, "No, look, you have the same toolkit as William Shakespeare. He only had these 26 letters as well. keep going, you're bound to strike it lucky, you know. Just keep. So this poem is called Spell, and it is asking us to say. So, spell. Summon the summoners, the 26 enchanters, spelling silence into sound. They bind and loose, they find and are not found. Recall the river tongues from Alf to Styx. Summon the summoners, the shaping shapes, the grounds of sound, the generative grammar, signs of the mystery, inscribed arcana, runes from the root tree written in the deeps, leaves from the tail tree lifted, swift and free, shining, recombining in their dance the genesis of every utterance, pattering the pattern of the tree. Summon the summoners and let them sing. The summoners will summon everything. And I think that sense of the summoners summoning everything is something that I find again and again in Tolkien. So let's just, I must watch my time, of course. Let's just go back to Tolkien in the 20s, in the late 20s. He's the youngest ever Oxford professor of the English language. And he's joined in Cambridge by another brilliant young man, C.S. Lewis. And at first they're quite edgy with each other. Tolkien, first of all, because, as you know, I'm sure, every academic faculty is deeply riven and divided within the subject between the different protagonists and antagonists. And in Oxford, the English faculty was divided between the language school, who thought you should never bother to study literature. Any fool can read Dickens. You know, why do you need a teacher? What you must do is study Anglo-Saxon and Middle High German, and you know you must understand the roots of language and learn grammar too much. And the literature people were saying, this is ridiculous, we don't need this, we can look this up in books. What we need to know is, how is it that we have the tradition of literature we have? How can we best understand and appreciate? So Tolkien was the professor of the language side. Lewis was the literature guy. Then also, Tolkien was a Roman Catholic. He was deeply instructed Catholic, very devout. His mother had converted from the Church of England to the Catholic Church and had been deeply persecuted for it. So for Tolkien, it was visceral. You know, it was. C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast out of an Ulster Protestant family, where tragically the sectarian divide between Protestant and Catholic was very deep. In fact, terrible. The Protestant settlers had the upper hand. They had the best land, you know, in the north particularly. The Catholics were quite oppressed. The words that would be used, Protestant boys, as they brought up, were brought up to call the Irish Catholics bog trotters, because Lewis is too profound a thinker and good to have stayed in that, but there is something of that in the background. So when they first struck up a friendship, they were overcoming both academic and sectarian divides. And it was remarkable, you know, that they did that. So what was there to bring them together? It was the love of language and poetry. Lewis loved especially the stories of the North. He loved the Norse mythologies, the Icelandic sagas, which he was only reading in translation. And Tolkien had started a little group called the Coalbiters, which is, a coalbiter is an Icelandic kenning for old men who sit so close to the fire, hogging all the heat, that they could be biting the coal. And the Coalbiters was a little group who would read the Icelandic sagas, and this one by Snorri and the Elder, in Icelandic. And he would help them translate as they went along. And fortunately, the poetry of Iceland was sufficient to break the ice on, both the Protestant Catholic and the language literature divide. So that's how they met each other, and then they became real friends. And then Tolkien took an enormous risk. He, probably only about a year or two into the friendship, it was in 1928. Unbeknownst to everybody else, Tolkien even then had begun to construct the whole world of his legendarium and Middle-earth. And the central to that, though we didn't get to read it till later when the Silmarillion came out, but central to that was the lay of Beren and Luthien, the story of Beren and Luthien, which is also the meeting of mortals and immortals, of men and elves, and in the end, that story is recapitulated in Aragorn and Arwen. And they are descended, in fact, it is the story happening. So Beren and Luthien was so important. I mean, now if you go to the churchyard in Oxfordshire, where Tolkien and his wife are buried, on the tombstones it just says Beren, Luthien. So this was deep heart stuff. And he had begun it in the trenches. Now, this is not what, and he had invented, of course, the whole world and invented languages. It was already unfolding. But it's not what Oxford professors were supposed to be doing with their spare time. So it was a bit. Anyway, he passed on to Lewis. At this time, the story was written in rhyming couplets, the lay of Beren and Luthien. And Lewis read it in a weekend, and he loved it. But it was a risk. Lewis could have just said, why are you wasting your time with this sub-romantic slush, But he didn't. And Lewis did an even better thing. Lewis responded to it, not with a letter, as from C.S. Lewis, to Tolkien, saying, this is what I think is good, and this is where I think you could improve this line or whatever. But he pretended that he had been given a lost manuscript of a medieval poem, and that this was but there were other manuscripts and recensions. So when he wanted to make comments, he invented, medieval scholars who'd been studying this text for years, and he made all his comments as though they were the judicial final comments of a scholar who'd studied the different recensions. And he said, although these lines in the manuscript you've given me, they're not quite as strong as the ones in this recension here. Let's add this reading, which is his way of saying, I think I can make a better line for you. And of course, that playfulness was perfect. And Tolkien absolutely loved it. And so he began to share more with Lewis. And indeed, he said later that when he was beginning what became The Lord of the Rings, which eventually the Inklings called The New Hobbit, because he'd written... He said for a while, C.S. Lewis was his only reader. He passed the manuscripts on. And there were many times when he might have given up, and we might never have had The Lord of the Rings, but for this one enthusiastic reader. I say this to young writers and poets who think, oh, I have hardly any readers. I said, all you need is one. One who understands what you're doing. And then things will grow. So that founded a great friendship, and Lewis, when he wrote back to Tolkien about the first drafts of The Lord of the Rings, he said. Let me see if I can find... Yeah. This is what Lewis said. He actually repeated this in a review of The Lord of the Rings when it finally came out, but he's writing 20 years before that. He's writing back about The Lord of the Rings, the prose Lord of the Rings. And he says this, the two things that come out clearly are the sense of reality in the background and the mythical value. Then he says the essence of a myth being that it should have no taint of allegory to the maker, and yet should suggest incipient allegories to the reader. That's really interesting. Tolkien said, I cordially dislike allegory, and I avoid it wherever I can. It's not quite true, because he did write an allegory called Leaf by Niggle. But what does Lewis say? He says, it's great myth, it's mythopoeic. It has no taint of allegory to the maker, and yet it suggests incipient allegories, plural, to the reader. So the story, in other words, knows something more than the actual writer of the story knows. That's very interesting. So what do we mean by that? So what we mean by allegory in the purest sense, as Lewis and Tolkien were using the word, and of course Lewis had written a great book on medieval literature called The Allegory of Love. So in a pure allegory, the author of the allegory already has an idea, an abstract idea. You know, let's say these three abstract ideas called A, B, and C. And for the sake of clarity or entertainment or whatever, he translates these ideas into the terms of a story and calls them, let's say, X, Y, and Z. But X is A and Y is B and Z is C. And then when you've read X, Y, and Z, you can translate it back and you get A, B, C again, just the same. It's unmodified by the transition into the allegorical text. It's simply a series of equivalences, which might even be random. And there was this kind of allegory has been written, obviously. There is a medieval play in English called Everyman. And there is a character in it called Everyman. And he meets another character called Strength. And Strength says to him, I will be your guide, you must depend on me as long as... But Strength doesn't last. Suddenly Strength becomes weak and Everyman is hobbling. And he meets another character called Beauty, and he meets a character called Riches. And each of these characters help him for a while and then disappear. And, you know, Everyman. So this is an allegory. You know exactly what's going on. That's not what the great writings of Tolkien are, or the Lord of the Rings. They're suggestive of incipient allegories. So Tolkien is writing at a deep mythopoeic level in which the story itself bodies forth, we go back to Shakespeare, imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. The things unknown may actually be unknown to the author and may only later become known to the reader. So a classic example of this is because he was working on these books right through the 30s and 40s, the basic plots were forming. But the book itself, The Lord of the Rings, didn't come out until the early 50s, so 1952. Now, at that time, after Hiroshima and the beginning of the Cold War and the whole problem of the building up of nuclear arsenals and what they called the doctrine of what is unbelievable, which they called mutually assured destruction. So we wouldn't have a war because we would each, you know, and the acronym, of course, of mutually assured destruction is MAD. Anyway, because that was in the air and the book came out, and everybody assumed that the ring was a thinly veiled allegory for the power of nuclear weapons, that we cannot, the enemy's weapon has fallen into our hands, but we cannot use it. And Tolkien and Lewis had a good laugh about this, drinking beer in the Eagle and Child in Oxford, because the atom bomb hadn't even been thought of when the fundamental plot, and behind it, the story of the Silmarils, and yet, people were not wrong. They were wrong to think it was deliberate allegory, but they were not wrong to find it applicable, to find the incipient allegory. And what I want to do, I must be careful of my time, is just open up, if you like, some of the incipient allegories, or some of the ways in which the story bodies forth the form of things which we do indeed know or need to know and understand more. Some of them are issues. So first of all, I want to... Tolkien He's a Catholic thinker. He's obviously very well instructed, and he's conscious of the doctrine which is largely associated with St. Augustine, which is that everything that is created is good. That evil is not a created thing. There's no initial evil in the world. Evil is a corruption of good. It is a wound in the being of goodness, as Augustine puts it in one place. So a thing has to be good first before it can be evil. So I mean, when I'm trying to teach this, and I illustrate it with you, if I say about a fridge, that's a bad fridge, it's a no good fridge, I have to know what the fridge is for. That a good fridge keeps my beer cold, and a bad fridge doesn't. So I'm already paying the fridge at least a potential compliment that I know has an initial good. So this description to Augustine's reading of the fall of the angels, it's very important to know that Lucifer is a being of light. Lucifer, literally light carrier. Yeah. And that Adam and Eve are created good. So, and all this is very beautifully reworked in the beginning of the Silmarillion, with the music of the Aenor and the Melkor being good, but then only becoming Morgoth later. And the change in nature is a change in nature. So he understands that. Now, therefore, if we want to examine this, we always have to understand it's worth having binaries in which you're not total absolute binary, but pairs which enable you to think and to notice what is good. Because one of the deepest problems of our culture is that when something is abused, we sometimes extirpate and destroy the thing itself rather than just the abuse. We lose the good possibility because we can't see past the corrupt version of that. So let's consider how many interesting pairings there are to allow us to think about the difference between an original goodness or a prime or ideal way of being a certain kind of person and what happens to its various forms of perversio, of corruption, yeah? So it's extraordinary how many there are. Well, the obvious one right at the beginning is Frodo Gollum. It's really important, and it becomes clearer and clearer as the story goes, that Gollum was once some kind of hobbit. That's why he understands the riddles in the dark. And there is a kind of mutual recognition and kinship. And then, of course, both Frodo and Gollum have had the experience of the ring as a trial or test to who they are. And they understand one another at a deep level. But Gollum shows you what Frodo could potentially become if he did allow the ring to dominate him. But Frodo shows Gollum in some ways what he still might be. And the whole Smeargol, Daergol debate. So that's a very interesting pairing. But even there is something deeper still, something extraordinarily prophetic from Gandalf, when Frodo is very frightened and realizes Gollum is following them in Moria. And he says, what a pity that Bilbo didn't kill him while he had the chance. And Gandalf says, pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. Can you give life? Don't be so eager to deal death. The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. All of which comes true, though in fact we know from letters that Tolkien didn't know how it would come true at the time Gandalf said those words. Just like when Strider arrives, Tolkien had no more idea of who Strider was when he turned up than Frodo did. And again, when Faramir walks in, we have a letter from Tolkien to his son saying, I don't know who Faramir is, but let's take Faramir. Here's another pairing, Boromir and Faramir. They're brothers. They're from one heroic culture. They're sons of Denethor, the steward of Gondor. And they have the moment of crisis and testing when this long stewardship, the stewards sit at the base of the throne. The throne is for the king. Stewards were only, and of course steward is a very, very vital Christian word because of the idea of ourselves being stewards of creation and so on. So Denethor shows you how not to be a steward, we can't. But Boromir and Faramir have this choice. And we see Boromir, in a sense, falling through the desire for the ring. And we see Faramir resisting it. Faramir says, I would not pick this thing up if it lay in my way. And yet the same blood runs in both of their veins. So we see this pairing. But let's take it further. One of the most extraordinary pairings in this book is, which again bodies forth, helps us to see things that we might not otherwise see about ourselves or our society. So if you think about the pairing of Gandalf and Saruman, they are two versions of what it might be to be a wizard and to hold the powers of the wizard in Middle-earth. And at first we think, Saruman is the greater. Gandalf, the first reference we have to Saruman, Gandalf refers to him as the head of my order. And here's Saruman the White. But of course, we don't know until he captures Gandalf that he has one of the Palantir. I wish that odious man in America had not stolen the word Palantir. But again, Tolkien is a prophet, because that Palantir is indeed an instrument of evil in this world, just saying. So because Saruman has crumbled in the face of the apparently overwhelming strength of Mordor. And he makes a fatal decision, which is that he wants to be on the winning side, whether or not it's the right side. And the entire point of the story is that it's better to be on the right side, whether or not it's the winning side. This is an idea drawn from Norse mythology in the final battle of Ragnarok. It is better to be with the gods and men defeated at Ragnarok than to be with the giants and the monsters, even though they'll win, and one day Fenris, the wolf, will swallow the sun. But it's still better to be with the gods and men. But Saruman has been crushed. So then you get, in Orthanc, and in the context of the Ents, you get this extraordinary conversation. So Saruman suddenly reveals himself as no longer the Saruman the White, but Saruman of many colors. He will take whatever hue he likes. He is abandoning the primal good, if you like, the fiat lux, which lies behind all creation in Tolkien's view. He says the white light can be broken. And Gandalf says something extraordinary. He says, and I'm quoting directly here now, I forget the notes. He says, he who breaks a thing to find out what it is made of has left the path of wisdom. Now, we can think of a child breaking their toy because, not being able to put it together. Now, Tolkien is probably echoing two great English romantic poets on this very subject. One is Wordsworth, who says, we murder to dissect, which is not just about the fact of killing an animal and then taking it to pieces, but the fact that every time you take anything to pieces, in some sense, you kill something. Yeah? And the other line, of course, is Keats reading Newton's Optics and saying, oh, he has unwoven the rainbow. He's reduced this thing which was always an arch, it was always a gate, into something more. It was always, as Keats said in the Ode to a Nightingale, magic casements opening on perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. So he who breaks a thing to find out what it is made of has left the path of wisdom. Now, in the context, this is Gandalf to Saruman. But it is also Tolkien to the age of reductive analytics, of mere materialism, of critical deconstruction. It may be necessary to open a thing up and find out what it's made of, but you'd better be sure you know how to put it together again or to make something new. So he who breaks a thing to find out what it is made of has left the path of wisdom. And in fact, we also get the critique from Treebeard of Saruman. He has a mind of metal and wheels. Now, generally speaking, I'm more for the book than for the films. But I actually thought the films did the kind of industrialization of Orthanc pretty well, and the throwing of the trees in. But even in the narrative of the book, there's something extraordinary that because it's clear that Gandalf loves trees and Saruman hates trees. And he destroys the trees wantonly, but he does them to feed the fires of Orthanc in order to create weaponry, in order to hasten what we later learned to call the industrial military complex. But you see it right there. Now, the direct consequence of his contemptuous destruction of the trees, it's wonderful, yeah. I don't know if this is a good comment or a bad comment from Tolkien, but the direct consequence is that a flood comes. In the end, Orthanc, which dedicated itself to destructive fire and the energy of burning, is quenched by an inrush of water. Now, I just remark that the very issues analysed, or if you like, bodied forth in that passage, are precisely where we are now. We have burnt so many trees, we have used so much energy for consumption, and particularly for industrial military consumption, that we are now in danger, because of rising sea levels, of flood. Now, this is an example, this is literally prophecy, both in speaking truth to power, but also foreseeing. I'm not crediting privately the mind of Tolkien with foreseeing climate change and possible rise in sea levels. I'm not doing that. And that's exactly what Lewis said. The mind of the writer is completely innocent of any of these allegories. He's trusting the story. But the story is suggestive of incipient allegories, plural, in the minds of the reader, and that is why we keep going back to them. So I'll just have one more thing. I should stop now, but I'll give you one more example of the pairings that I think speak prophetically in the deepest sense. These are all different aspects of being human. We are all of the characters in The Lord of the Rings. So we had Frodo Gollum, which is, if you like, very much about dealing with pain and suffering in our inner life and if you like, the ordinary lowly things. Then we have Boromir and Faramir, which is about inherited stewardship. We have Saruman and Gandalf, which is, I think, about science, but also about learning, knowledge, wisdom. Now consider the other pairing, the return of the king. The king, the one who is actually meant to rule Middle-earth, is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Isildur's heir. But there is another one who claims to have the power to rule Middle-earth, and that, of course, is Sauron. And I think we are invited constantly to see a comparison between Sauron and Aragorn as two models of leadership, of kingship, of kingly rule in the temporal realm. And of course, the extraordinary thing with Aragorn is that he becomes the man he is long before he is crowned. And he becomes the man he is precisely by, in some sense, laying aside the crown. He takes the name Strider. He walks with the characters. He earns their friendship. He understands from the inside the life of the lowliest, particularly literally the smaller hobbits. And he actually he offers his sword to defend the hobbits. And he literally defends them from the Black Riders, who are another. So when he ascends the throne, he brings all that with him as a model of what genuine leadership, and let us even dare to say political leadership, might be. Sauron, on the other hand, is only and always about power. He's made the ring itself to dominate. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. Bind is the really important word. What power always wants to do is to bind and dominate. And a counter view of political power is the power that liberates, the power that actually sets people free to be themselves, which is, I think, modelled in all kinds of ways by Aragorn. Now, I fly back and forth between my own beloved island and the extraordinary experiment in nationhood, which is the United States, and is having its 250th anniversary, and here is a republic if you can keep it. And it seems to me questions about power and how power is wielded and who wields it and to what effect, and whether they actually want to lift up or to dominate and humiliate, are playing out right before our eyes in America and elsewhere, possibly also in my own nation. So there's a little hint of the way in which these writers, I don't think were looking backwards, they were looking forward. I don't think they were writing mere fantasy and unreality. I think they were giving us shapes and stories with which to understand the deepest realities in ourselves and in our society. Thank you very much for listening. I must get water. Yeah. Which of these?
I try to be more clear as possible.
Yeah.
Okay. You said that for Tolkien, evil was something that was born from good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea is that everything which God creates in the beginning is good, but it is free, and out of the freedom it is possible for it to become evil.
Yeah. So the fact that Sauron didn't forge the rings himself, but made them forged by Celebrimbor.
Yeah. But he forged the One Ring himself.
Okay.
Yeah. So the others forged. Yes. Yeah. So the reason why the three rings, like the ring of adamant that's on the finger of Galadriel, or the ring of fire which is on the finger of Gandalf, the reason why they can still do good is that they were not made by Sauron. But Sauron himself is only a sub-maker. Sauron is not. So Sauron, of course, is one of the Maya. He was originally good, but he is one of the angels, if you like, who was drawn off to the service of Morgoth. But that's why the One Ring cannot be used. I mean, it is altogether evil. But it's evil, but not... Eru himself, the god in that world, did not create the One Ring anymore, but he did create beings with freedom who could misuse that freedom to make something utterly evil. So there is no evil in primary creation, but there is a great deal of evil in secondary creation, because those who are doing the making in the secondary world are themselves fallen, if that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah.
I would like to talk about, I think, an connected book between Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. There is also The Hobbit. Do you think it has the same themes that you can find in Lord of the Rings?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean, if you read when you read The Hobbit after having read The Lord of the Rings, when you reread The Hobbit, I mean, I came to The Hobbit first, you realize the whole style of tone of the story is different. It's clearly a children's story. And, I mean, there are things in The Hobbit that he would never, like, for example, coffee. I mean, they have cups of tea and coffee in The Hobbit. Well, they're not drinking tea and coffee in Lothlorien. You know, so there's been a bit of a movement. The whole tone of the thing is different. It's the same world to some degree. It's interesting, when you read The Lord of the Rings after having read The Hobbit, you realize that there's a bit of a shift in that first chapter, the long-expected party, which is the parallel with the unexpected party in The Hobbit. There's a little bit of just fun and jollity. It's not quite reaching the same kind of gravitas and high style that comes later. There's a bit of a transition. So it's a different tone, and it's a smaller book. It's meant to be a smaller book. I think it's only... Originally, I don't think he thought The Hobbit was going to be connected with his other world. He already had the whole other world. He wasn't expecting it. It was a standalone tale. But then when the rumor comes about the necromancer and he begins to deal with the spiders in Mirkwood, he already has Ungoliant and the great spider that had eaten the tree of light and created, like that's already there in his mind. So what happens is that he starts The Hobbit almost as a free-floating little thing over the world. And the other world is his big secret that nobody knows about, apart from C.S. Lewis. But gradually the worlds come together. The Hobbit gravitates towards the bigger mass, if you like. So there's the connection. But I don't think The Hobbit is meant to have the same prophetic reach. Although, of course, as a child, I learned many things from The Hobbit. I learned a little bit about courage. When Bilbo comes to and he realizes he's completely lost and he's in the dark, and he says, I can't go back, I can't go sideways, all I can do is go on. Now, the number of times that has come to me since I was 8 and now I'm 68 as a very useful bit of advice in life. So there's lots of things like that. And I love the way, Bilbo is a very sympathetic character because he genuinely gets frightened and yet he finds courage within his fear. But of course, once it had all connected up and the ring became thing, Tolkien actually went back and rewrote the Riddles in the Dark chapter. Just yesterday, but 3 days ago, I was sitting literally in somebody's Hobbit hole that they'd made, holding a first edition of The Hobbit, which had that earlier chapter in it. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I probably overrun, but yeah.
I have a question, I was very interested in what you said in the beginning about, I have a lot of, I just asked one. About what you said about the allegory, that it's not, it happens in the book, but that doesn't happen in the mind of the writer.
Yeah, what he says is no taint of allegory to the maker, and yet suggesting, and that's allegory singular, no taint of allegory, this is Lewis writing to Tolkien, no taint of allegory to the maker, yet should suggest incipient allegories, plural, to the reader. Yeah.
Would that suggest that a true artist is the one who is not a creator, but is the perfect instrument of creation, as like
yeah.
For the Christian tradition?
Yes. I think most writers accept that there is an interplay between your will and shaping as a writer and something that is given to you. This is why we have words like inspiration. It's why you have the tradition of the muses. Now, I don't think it is an interplay. So it's not like automatic writing. You don't just sit down and something is dictated to you. You do the making and shaping, but at a certain point, the poem or the piece of writing, most writers would say it begins to have a life of its own. And many novelists say that once they have, quote unquote, created a character, the character then speaks back to them, and if they need for the plot, the character to do something which is out of character, the character says, no, I'm not going to do that. The author has to negotiate. There's something else. Now, there are different ways of explaining this. Somebody like Jung would talk about a deep unconscious creativity, which is perhaps collective, which we share, and that at a certain point a writer opens their mind to something deeper, as though they're drawing from a deeper well and something comes up. Others would have the idea, the idea of genius, originally the word genius was a being beyond yourself, genius loci. Until the 18th century, nobody said, this man is a genius. They said this man has a genius. A genius is visiting this person, a daemon, as the Greeks would have called it. Socrates said he had a daemon. He said at the end, where he says in the Apology, the daemon kept saying to him, "Sing, Socrates." And he thought maybe that just means do philosophy, but just in case, I'm going to write some poetry. So, and Socrates, again, in the Apology, says, when he's trying, he's told he's the wisest man in Athens, and he says, that's ridiculous, I'm not wise. And he goes around and asks all the people who are supposed to be wise, like the politicians, and realizes they think they're wise, but they've got no idea what they're doing. And he says he goes to the poets because there is great beauty and wisdom in them. But when he asks the poets themselves about their poetry, they've got no idea. So he says this way. So in the end, of course, famously, he says, the only reason why I am the wisest man in Athens is that I'm the only man who knows he's ignorant. And that is the beginning of wisdom. So every writer experiences this. Now, I think some people thought when we stopped talking about a muse or a genius, Loki or whatever, and we started talking about the unconscious, we were being more scientific. This is not true. We're simply exchanging a metaphor of outness to a metaphor of underness. But they're both metaphors. They're both speaking to the reality that what we do is partly made and partly given. Actually, I think a better metaphor for that creative process is the union of the masculine and the feminine. I think that every writer has this experience of, as it were, being big with book, being nurturing, needing the pains of giving birth. But they also kind of strike an idea. So there is a very fine essay about this by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney called The Fire in the Flint. He's writing about Gerard Manley Hopkins. So I think all writing at a deep level taps, whether you think it's out, up, or down, it taps into truths which the language itself knows, but we don't know. My muse, for what it's worth, is the language itself. That's what I was saying in my poem, Summon the Summoners, my poem Spell. I believe that all the words I use are older and wiser than I am. And in my way of writing poetry, my craft, such as it is like a genial host arranging who will sit where at a dinner party, so I can get the best conversation out of my guests. But then my guests arrive, these are the words, and my poem arises from overhearing their conversation. It's about what they know, not what I know. And I think that works also with talking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
2 points. First, you mentioned St. Augustus. I don't know if you know, but St. Augustus is buried in Pavia.
Oh, really? Oh, that's wonderful. I'm sorry.
Second, the status of the poet, the storyteller.
Yeah.
In many societies, even in Afghanistan today, but in the Darwin societies and our forefathers sitting around the campfire, the storyteller, the poet, was revered.
Yeah.
And he, and was normally a man, was probably the most valuable person in the group.
Because they had the memory of the whole people inside them.
Yeah. And he taught morality.
Yeah.
He taught about the heroes
Yeah.
of the group. And he was an entertainer.
Yeah.
They didn't have TV or radio.
Exactly.
They didn't read. So
Yeah.
it was important to have somebody to while away those 2
Yeah.
hours between dinner and bedtime.
Absolutely.
Today, the status of the storyteller, the poet, I think has been diminished greatly,
Yeah.
in large part because we have technology.
Yes.
One could say, well, we also have all the books that have been written, so you just go back and read the old books. But I sense that this society, mankind, has lost this appreciation for creativity
Yeah.
and storytelling. Whereas we have HBO or Netflix, we have YouTube, and lots of other things that come from the technology, which, I guess one could say, well, in order to create that, you have to have.
Yeah, you have to create it. But I think you're right that we don't have the same reverence for poetry. But this is partly the fault of poetry, because after Eliot, poetry became very cliquey, it became very difficult, it became very academic. And it stopped delivering the pleasure and beauty that, say, earlier poets like Tennyson had delivered. The last person to write about Arthur is Terence. So I think we may be coming for a turn. I think Tolkien is a poet in just that sense. Now, I think we need to retell these old stories. And I mean, just to speak personally for a moment, I have wanted for many years, contra mundum, against all this stuff, to write an epic poem. And to write a national epic poem, an epic poem of the great story of what's called the Matter of Britain, of my islands, the whole cycle of stories about Arthur and Merlin and the Grail. And there came a certain point in my 60s where I thought, well, if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it. I'm going to do it. So I've done it. So I thought, when I was speaking to publishers, I said, you're supposed to have this USP, the unique selling point. So I said, well, the unique selling point is that nobody has done this for 150 years. But that might also be the unique sinking point. There might be, like, nobody will want this. There might be. But interestingly, the first volume has just come out. And to my surprise and to the delight of my publisher, it is on the American bestsellers list. It's number 15 in Publishers Weekly hardback fiction. And hardback non-fiction, that's funny. They decided Arthur is non-fiction. So maybe there is a place for it. I mean, I am now 2/3 of the way writing through this. I'm writing volume 3, and it will probably be the last thing I do. But I do it in the hope of reviving exactly that role of the poet. Not only an entertainer, but a teacher, a remembrancer, somebody who tells you the stories that bind you to life. Sorry, you're going to... Okay, well, maybe we should draw stumps at that point. If I don't want to make people miss their supper.